Imagine a place so cold, so isolating, that even the most hardened criminals beg to be transferred out. A place designed not just to punish, but to break you, piece by piece, mind by mind. They call it ADX Florence, the most secure prison in America, the place the government sends people it never wants to see again. Here, silence isn't peace, it's punishment. Inmates spend 23 hours a day locked inside concrete boxes, alone. No windows, no touch, no sound. Just four walls and the voices in their heads. And if those voices get too loud, well, that's when ADX does what it was built to do: break men. Deep in the mountains of Colorado sits a facility nicknamed the Alcatraz of the Rockies. But unlike Alcatraz, no one here is planning a daring escape, because escape is impossible. ADX Florence was opened in 1994, a response to the chaos of America's most violent prisons. It was meant for the worst of the worst: terrorists, serial killers, gang leaders, and traitors. Every movement is calculated, every sight, every sound, every breath, controlled. The architecture itself is designed to destroy connection. Cells are shaped to prevent suicide. Windows are tilted toward the sky, so inmates can't even see the horizon. Every conversation, every word is monitored. They call it control through isolation. But former inmates call it something else: a living death. Behind these walls are names you've heard before: Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber; Ramzi Yousef, the man behind the 1993 World Trade Center bombing; Richard Reed, the shoe bomber; and until 2021, El Chapo Guzman, the world's most infamous drug lord. But the truth about ADX Florence isn't just in the names. It's in what happens after they arrive. Men who once led armies, cartels, or terror networks begin to crumble, one by one. According to former guards, some inmates start talking to themselves after just a few weeks, others to the walls. Some smear their own blood on the floor just to feel something real. And then there are the screams, the kind you hear echoing through the air vents at night and never forget. Officials claim ADX is about safety, keeping dangerous men from hurting others. But even correctional officers have admitted that this kind of isolation changes people. Inside, prisoners live with no human touch for decades. Their food is slid through a slot. Their only walk is in a small concrete cage they call the dog run. One former inmate wrote, "You don't realize how much you need to see another human until it's taken away. The silence feels alive. It eats at you." Medical reports show alarming rates of self-harm, hallucinations, and psychosis. Some inmates gouge their skin with broken plastic spoons. Others whisper about shadows that talk back. It's not just punishment. It's psychological warfare. In 2012, a former inmate named Jack Powers filed a lawsuit describing what really happens inside ADX. He said he saw men swallow razor blades. One man bit off his own finger. Another smeared feces on his walls and screamed for days until the guards dragged him out, lifeless. The U.S. Bureau of Prisons denied mistreatment, but soon after, dozens of similar stories surfaced. The lawsuit grew, and for the first time, the government admitted that some inmates at ADX were mentally ill. They were supposed to be in hospitals, not isolation cells. So why were they here? Because ADX doesn't just hold criminals. It holds secrets. And yet, some refuse to break. Take Thomas Silverstein, one of America's most dangerous inmates. He spent 36 years in solitary confinement, longer than anyone in US history. They said he killed a guard in 1983. He said the system killed him first. For decades, he spoke to no one. He wrote letters to imaginary friends. And in one of his final notes before his death, he wrote, "I've been buried alive in this concrete tomb for so long, I forget what the sun feels like." That's the paradox of ADX Florence. The place built to contain evil ends up creating it. Human rights groups have called ADX a clean version of hell. They argue that isolation on this scale isn't punishment, it's torture. But the government insists it's necessary. They point to the inmates, men who bombed planes, murdered guards, plotted attacks. They say, these aren't people you rehabilitate. Still, even guards whisper about the toll it takes on them. Walking the halls of silence, watching men lose their minds, hearing screams through concrete and knowing they can't help, because here mercy is weakness, and weakness is contagious. ADX Florence was built to keep chaos out of the world. But inside, chaos rules quietly. No riots, no escapes, just slow psychological decay. For years, journalists, lawyers, even foreign governments have demanded transparency, but the doors of ADX don't open easily, and the men who leave, they rarely speak. Because to survive ADX, you have to kill a part of yourself. And once that part is gone, you never get it back. Welcome to ADX Florence, the prison that breaks men. At ADX Florence, time doesn't move. It circles. Every day begins the same and ends the same. Inmates wake at 5:30 a.m. to the clank of steel bolts unlocking electronically. A light flickers on. Breakfast, a paper tray slid through the slot. They eat sitting on a cold concrete bench, staring at the same grey wall. There's no dining hall, no chatter, no human sound. Just silence, and the smell of disinfectant that never leaves. They're allowed 1 hour of recreation per day in a small outdoor cage about the size of a garage. They call it the dog run. You can see the sky, but not the mountains. You can hear birds, but never touch grass. After that hour, they return to their cells, 7 by 12 feet of concrete and control. Lunch at 10:30, dinner before 4 o'clock, no mirrors, no windows, no real conversations. Just a television screen showing educational programs, news, and sometimes the world they'll never touch again. Some inmates say they watch the news not to stay informed, but to remember they still exist. Psychologists call it sensory deprivation psychosis, a condition that turns the mind against itself. At first, inmates count bricks or trace patterns in the ceiling. Then they start hearing things, tapping noises that aren't there, voices whispering their names. In 2009, an inmate named Jose Vega began speaking to a man he believed lived in the air vent. He held full conversations, laughing, crying, arguing with someone who didn't exist. After 8 months, he was found unresponsive, his face pressed against the vent. He'd suffocated himself. That's the danger of ADX Florence. The walls don't just contain you. They become you. Even the guards inside ADX aren't untouched. They call themselves ghost keepers. They see men slowly unraveling, and they can't intervene. Every door they open requires 2 other officers, electronic confirmation, and a control room watching from above. One officer described it like this: "We don't work with inmates. We work with echoes of who they used to be. Some guards quit after a few months. Others stay, but lose something in their eyes. Even they start dreaming of the silence. Because in ADX the walls listen too. Everything inside ADX operates under the code of control. Every motion monitored, every inmate catalogued, every second recorded. To speak to a psychologist, an inmate must talk through a slot in a metal door. To shower, they must kneel, cuffed, while another officer controls the water. To send a letter, every word is read before it ever leaves the prison. For many, this isn't prison. It's erasure. There's no rehabilitation here, only management of existence. One wrong look, one outburst, and privileges vanish for months. Imagine that. No sound, no color, no touch, just you and the hum of fluorescent lights. Few have ever managed to leave ADX Florence early, alive. But some still try to beat the system. In 1995, Richard McCoy Jr., a former army pilot turned skyjacker, was rumored to be planning an escape, even from ADX. The same McCoy many believe was connected to the legendary D.B. Cooper case. He spent months studying guard schedules, memorizing door sounds, timing food deliveries. He even claimed he could fly out of hell. But before he could act, his cellmate turned him in exchange for extra rec time. A week later, McCoy slit his wrists with a sharpened toothbrush. On the wall, he'd written 2 words in his blood. Still flying, that's ADX in one phrase, the dream of freedom, painted in blood. One psychiatrist who studied ADX inmates described their mental decline like a clock. Tick by tick, sanity fades. He said, first, they lose sense of time. Then they lose language. Then they lose themselves. Some inmates refuse to speak for years. Others write hundreds of pages of letters to imaginary people. One man spent 2 years collecting dust from the vent and arranging it into patterns, then cried when guards cleaned it up. In the outside world, he'd be diagnosed and treated. In ADX, he was disciplined for destruction of property. This is how men vanish, without dying. But there's one thing about ADX Florence few people know. Beneath the main cell blocks lies a section not listed on public blueprints, known by insiders as the Black Corridor. No inmate has ever confirmed its existence, but whispers persist. It's said to house those who disappear, men who cross lines even the Bureau doesn't admit exist. Informants, spies, rogue agents. They moved him downstairs. No record, no file. Gone. If that's true, then ADX Florence isn't just the end of freedom. It's the end of memory itself. By the early 2010s, whispers had become noise. Former inmates, and even a few guards, started talking about what ADX Florence really does to people. A class-action lawsuit was filed, Bacote v's Federal Bureau of Prisons. The claim that men were being driven insane by isolation, that the US government was running a psychological experiment disguised as a prison. The documents revealed horrors. Prisoners who smeared feces on walls were punished instead of treated. Men who cut themselves open were left bleeding until shift change. A psychiatrist begged for transfers, denied. The Bureau of Prisons argued these were exaggerations, that ADX Florence was essential for national security. But behind closed doors, even they knew something was cracking. Internal memos described unmanageable psychiatric deterioration, and yet the machine rolled on. Because shutting down ADX meant admitting the United States had built a factory of madness. A former administrative staffer later leaked internal communications, emails between wardens and regional directors. They described a disturbing pattern. Reports of suicide attempts being rewritten as self-inflicted injuries, deaths listed as medical complications, and incident videos mysteriously lost from the archive. One report described a man who ceased breathing during restraint. Another, a fall that occurred in a cell with no furniture, no steps, and no way to climb. The leaks went nowhere. The media was stonewalled. The courts delayed. ADX Florence wasn't just secure, it was untouchable, and anyone who pushed too hard transferred, demoted, or disappeared. In 2015, a series of photographs surfaced online, supposedly taken inside ADX by a contractor. They vanished within 48 hours, but not before a few were mirrored across the internet. They showed narrow grey hallways, numbered steel doors, and a small outdoor yard with high mesh ceilings. But one photo, the one the Bureau tried hardest to scrub, showed something else. A handwritten message on the inside of a cell door, written in what looked like rust or blood. The words were simple: "We are still here." Digital forensic analysts traced the image metadata. It came from a device used by an official government contractor assigned to ADX maintenance. But when reporters tried to contact him, he was unavailable for comment, and 1 week later, terminated. That was the last anyone heard from him. Only a handful of inmates have ever been released from ADX Florence alive, and those who did don't talk much. But in 2018, one man, name withheld, agreed to speak to a journalist anonymously. He'd spent 12 years in ADX. When asked what it was like, he didn't answer right away. He just said, "Have you ever watched someone die without dying?" He described seeing men rot mentally, hearing screams that didn't sound human. And the worst part? When they stopped screaming, that's when you knew they were gone for good. He said the silence was the real weapon. That even now, years later, he sleeps with a radio on, because if the room gets too quiet, he starts to hear the vents again. What began in the mountains of Colorado spread. Governments around the world began building supermax facilities modeled after ADX Florence. Australia, the United Kingdom, Brazil, even Norway, countries once known for rehabilitation, began experimenting with isolation-based control. They called it the Florence model. Critics warned it was a blueprint for psychological annihilation, but to others, it was efficiency. No riots, no escapes, no witnesses. It was control perfected. Today, nearly 100 prisons across the globe operate under Florence-style confinement, turning punishment into silence and silence into policy. When ADX Florence was built, it was meant to protect society from monsters. But no one asked what happens when a system becomes the monster itself. The Eighth Amendment of the US Constitution forbids cruel and unusual punishment. But what's cruelty when it's sanitized by policy? What's torture when it's written into procedure? Some call ADX the end of the line. But the truth is darker. It's a mirror. What you see inside those walls is what happens when justice forgets mercy. In 2022, an independent investigative report uncovered something buried deep within federal archives, a declassified design memo from the early 1990s when ADX was still being planned. It detailed the psychological objectives of the architecture itself, to induce environmental deprivation and identity erosion. The goal was not rehabilitation, but compliance through psychological disintegration. One line was underlined in red ink. It read, "The ultimate security is achieved when a man forgets he exists." And that's the secret of ADX Florence. It doesn't just break men. It makes them vanish from history, from memory, from themselves. You can't escape from ADX, because once you enter, ADX never leaves you.